Good evening, everyone. This is September 30th, the day after Michaelmas 2021, and I'm Cynthia Hoven, and I'm just delighted to be with you. This is the first of 3 talks that I'm happy to give to you, to offer to you in celebration and honoring the season of Michaelmas and the spiritual being whom we know as Michael. Michaelmas. Michaelmas, I don't know the breadth and the depth of the experience that you, my listeners, have with Michaelmas. And so in these 3 series, I'm going to be offering thoughts that will hopefully be nourishment and inspiration to people on all different levels of familiarity. The word Michaelmas is a reference to an archangel named Michael. And so if I were to say this word in common English, I would say Michaelmas. And this is like saying the word Christmas, Michaelmas. And Michaelmas is a festival, the festival of the autumn, that is celebrated every year on September 29th. What is Michaelmas? Those of you who were raised in the Catholic Church will be familiar with Michaelmas. I'm always surprised to talk to people who were raised Catholic who are familiar with this being. I, on the other hand, was raised as a Protestant, and very early in church history, the Protestants did away with saints and angels and archangels, and I had no idea what Michaelmas was until I began my eurythmy training at the age of 23, and not long after that, I began to find out about the Waldorf School movement, and that began an immersion into a whole richness of learning anthroposophy that has followed me my entire life. And so I'll take you on that journey with me. And this is a journey that feeds me so much year after year. And I will say in all candor and all honesty that the more dramatic, the more powerful, and indeed the more dramatic the situations of our planet, of our Earth are becoming, the more the urgency of the season of Michaelmas appears to me to be. So this evening, in our first talk, I'll begin by talking about Michael as the archangel, the spiritual being who is the guiding source of autumn. Next week, we will go deeper and we'll talk about Michael as the angel, the guiding spirit of this more or less 350-year cycle that we're living in. And the next year, the deeper dive that I'll take is speaking about the forces of evil, the so-called adversaries with whom we are confronted at all times, and the spiritual beings known as Lucifer and Ahriman, and the work that we have to do in relationship to them. So I'm planning a deep dive. Now, I'd like to begin by showing you a couple of the books that I turn to again and again. The first one of them was the first significant book that I found when my quest in anthroposophy gradually led me into the church, the religious movement known as the Christian Community Movement. And this is a rebirth or a reformulation, or even better said, a renewal of Christianity and the esoteric Christian rituals that Rudolf Steiner founded and directed in response to the question of some Catholic and some Episcopal priests who said, is there any kind of religion that's appropriate for the modern human being? He said, yes, I could help you with that, although that's not exactly what I want to do. I want to teach spiritual science, but yes, I'll help you. So my path as a eurythmist did involve also learning about esoteric Christianity, and that's an essential part of learning to know what it is to be a human being and what we're striving to become. And so the first book that I read in my journey is this one. It's called The Christian Year by Evelyn Frances Derry. And actually this woman, Evelyn Derry, changed her name. So it's the book is now available in a more modern form as Evelyn Frances Capel, C-A-P-E-L. And I don't know how easy the book is to get in America. It's available through the Christian Community Movement, but it's published in English in England. But it tells about the entire festival of the sacred year, which is what I'm going to be talking about in the course of this first evening. Rudolf Steiner also gave this lecture series, The Festivals and Their Meanings, talking about the whole cycle of the years. And another one, which I can't show to you because I can't put my hands on it in English, but it's called The Four Seasons and the Archangels, which is also essential for this work that we're doing. Then we also have books that are speaking directly about the Archangel Michael. And I would very much like to tell you about them. The first is called The Mission of the Archangel Michael, and a very deep, in-depth book. And then my favorite book, oh, here's The Mission of the Archangel Michael in purple. And then my very favorite book is called The Michael Mystery, a well-read and well-used book that I'm fond of calling my desert island book, because if I could only live with one book for the rest of my life, this would be it. These are essays that Rudolf Steiner wrote about the Archangel Michael in the last year, the last half year of his life. And they're short and powerful essays. And in my experience, it's as if Rudolf Steiner is recasting all of anthroposophy, cosmic evolution, the evolution of consciousness, the creation of the world, the dark forces of the dragon, Ahriman, Christ, all of that in this book, and I love it. These essays are the second half of this book, in case any of you have already tried to read the Anthroposophical Leading Thoughts. The Michael letters are the second half of this book, beginning with essays written on August 17th. So that's a lot of words, and I don't want to overwhelm you with all of these details. There is one more book that I will refer to in our last week, and that's this. It's actually written in the 70s, but I was recently recommended to read this, and it's quite nice. It's called The Enigma of Evil. So these are all themes that are involved in our journey of Michael. So as I said, we'll be looking at Michael as the archangel of the autumn time. And already with a concept like that, we have two surprising, wonderful ideas. They were surprising to me as a Protestant meeting these ideas for the first time, to think that the year has different qualities. By now, that's an obvious fact, of course, and also that there are spiritual beings whose signature lives through the different festivals of the year. So that's where we'd like to start tonight. For those of you who would like to stand up and have a quasi-eurythmy movement with me to begin this, I welcome you. I invite you to stand up. And if you don't want to stand, you can just think this exercise through with me. This is not quite eurythmy, but it's a spatial, an enlivening spatial exercise. Feel a circle around yourself. Feel the difference between light above, the widths around you, and the depths below you. When you have that circle, you feel the difference between gravity and levity and balance. Now spread your arms wide. Imagine with this that you're standing at the fulcrum points, the balance points of the world. This is representative of the equinox. And we've just passed the equinox, the time when summer or when light and dark are equal. We've just passed the autumn equinox. And so now let's lower our arms. In lowering our arms, we're coming more into gravity, but imagine you're going into darkness. The days are getting shorter. The forces of the depths are increasing until we come to the winter solstice. Dark, short days, at least in the northern hemisphere, the mysteries of midwinter. And now turn your hands and imagine to yourself what happens as we pass through the mysteries of midwinter and life begins to rise up, rising up until we come to springtime, which gives us the spring or the vernal equinox. Again, day and night are in balance mostly. And now we'll continue and imagine, remember what happens in summertime. When plants are in full bloom, we have etheric oils, the air is rich, filled with butterflies. And then turn your palms down gradually. The fruits will ripen. And then the summer begins to fade and we come back to where we are here. Good, we'll continue, we'll repeat that movement a few times and enliven that feeling for yourself. Down into the depths of the winter solstice. Turn your palms up. Gradually life begins to rise to the spring equinox, rising more until there's light all around. The air is filled with life and life comes to fulfillment, and then the fruits can be harvested. The season is done. The earth carries now the seeds, and they're placed into the darkness of the earth. We'll linger here for a moment, and we say in winter, in the depths of winter, and in some climates, not where I am, but in some climates, in the depths of winter, the earth is covered with snow. And although outwardly we see little activity, actually, in fact, there's incredible inner activity happening. So imagine in this darkness, you have inner life, inner vitality. And now out of that inner vitality, we have a new birth. This is why the mysteries, the sacred mysteries, always celebrated what happens when we have the midnight sun. Here at Easter, imagine, or at the equinox to begin with, imagine that the rising forces burst out of the earth and rise in green and plants until here they flower, they grow. And now imagine that all of this life is, all of the possibilities of life is in full blossom, and the seeds have nothing left. The seeds have turned themselves inside out. And we say that there, the spirit of the earth is dreaming. This whole time when you're lowering your arms, the earth is completely in matter and not in possibilities. And now, Those possibilities are embodied and embedded in the seeds. The seeds go to the earth, to the winter solstice. And in times of old, the great mystery teachers taught people to look for the midnight sun. And from the midnight sun, life rises. The forces of resurrection and the seeds become reality, outwardly manifest. They've given it all away, they're empty. We would face death if we didn't go down into gravity again. We'll go a step deeper now. And again, even if you're sitting, you can carry this with us. This winter time in the Christian year is a season of Christmas, in which obviously we celebrate the birth of child, the birth of spirit in the human kingdom, the birth of spirit in the depths of winter, in the child in the manger, in poverty, amongst the animals, rising energy. Here we celebrate the Easter festival, resurrection, overcoming death. Here is another reality. We celebrate what's known as St. John's Tide, and we'll speak more about that in a minute. And then life fades, and here we are at the festival that is called in the Christian year, Michaelmas, getting ready to go into the depths of the earth. Right. Now, let's continue this journey and then come to terms with what's happening with these different archangels that belong to the different series, the different seasons. We'll begin with the Christmas season, and that's because the season of Advent and Christmas is called the season of the beginning of the so-called Christian year. And this is the season where new birth happens in the depths. And there is a spiritual being connected with this season, and this is the Archangel Gabriel. Gabriel, we'll talk more about him next week, but he has a very interesting gesture. He was, in the story of Adam and Eve, he was the archangel who was, if you will, sent by God to say, Adam and Eve, you want to eat the apple, you can have it, it's fine, but go. You can't stay in the innocence of paradise anymore. Go. I'll call you back later on, but now you have to leave. He says in the old Christmas plays that were celebrated in Europe, he said, I will call you back, late and slow, but yes, I will call you back. And then the next time that I know of him being seen, that only shows the scarceness of my own knowledge of these Jewish mysteries. But the next time we see him is that he was the angel who gave the annunciation to Mary that she was going to have a child. So pictures of the Archangel Gabriel always belong to Christmas time. And then at Easter, this season, we have a different archangel, and this is the archangel known as Raphael. Raphael has always been called the archangel of healing. Healing in that he overcomes death and brings new life. There's something also, he's connected in the planets to Mercury. So he's the one who understands how to bring change, how to change these rising forces and bring new life, bring healing. He is, in a way, the mentor for the mercurial processes that the alchemists use. And he will also teach how to use the plants and things for healing. Raphael. And then we have at high summer, very interesting phenomenon. And I told you that we have all the plants open to the skies, to the in their fragrance and colors, and dragonflies and butterflies. And in that season, we have an archangel known as Uriel. And Uriel is portrayed as a very somber spiritual archangel being. And for me to help you understand that, you must imagine how it would be for you if you were suddenly entirely opened and you had no place to hide the dark shadows of your soul, your secrets, your shortcomings, none of that, that you could be read like an open book by the spiritual world. On the plant level, that's what we're seeing, and that all the flowers are open, being touched and kissed by the insects. If that would happen to us, entirely open, we would be pretty naked. Uriel is known as the archangel who judges our deeds, the deeds that we have done in the past year. And he is known as a rather sober archangel. Hearts are weighed and deeds are assessed in that spirit. We are hopeless. That's a difficult time, those long summer days. You probably also know that in the far northern zones, in the northern hemisphere, in the heights of summer, people practice staying up all night and jumping over bonfires. That's an old tradition. And in the southern hemisphere, of course, your long summer days happen in December. I don't know if you jump over bonfires there, but sometimes we are mindful of what it's like for you at these opposite seasons. And now we come to our topic for this evening, the season of Michaelmas. Let's imagine for a moment. Imagine that we lived in the age where we had no electricity, no comfort, no internal heating in our houses. Imagine that we didn't have the possibility of storing up our crops. Imagine all that. Imagine, try to make clear to yourself the kind of uncertainty that we as humanity faced in ancient times getting ready for the depths of winter. We as human beings get a lot of strength by imagining things vividly. So try to move that picture in yourself. What was it like before we had our modern day comforts to face winter? Have you grown enough crops? Have you killed enough game, dried it and stored it? Do you have enough fuel for your fires? What will you do with your animals? How is this going to work? And then the days get colder and colder and colder, until you get to these deep places of the winter solstice. And we know that the deprivation is given a brief reprieve at the winter solstice, but those of us who've lived through a deep winter know that it's usually not until February that we start to feel a bit of a warming, snow melting, the days getting a bit longer. But the signature I want to impress upon us is a kind of fear that we have in the time of autumn. Not necessarily the deep, deep, deep existential fear, but we have the archetypal experience of uncertainty. And if that goes to its extreme, it would be fear. And this is where Michael becomes the guardian of the autumn. And Michael wants to see us, to give us the courage to face the dark. And now notice that we're going to follow this thread of Michael's mandate to give us courage as we go into the darkness. Because this is the theme that we're going to talk about as we imagine the darkness going of Persephone going into darkness, the darkness of Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden, the darkness of the dragon threatening the lady. Let's take a moment to talk about those mythologies and looking also at the darkness that we face in our present time. And that topic will take up more in the next 2 weeks, but we're going to prepare that right now. Everything will depend on us overcoming darkness, going forward in time. And part of that, and I'd like to already write that on our inner mind, that we have to enliven our thinking so that we become aware of the spiritual nature of the world that we're living in. This is the true task of our time. And that is also what we're going to work at. But let's continue to lay the boundary a little bit. For instance, right now, I said that these 4 seasons of the year are inhabited or carried by archangels. A person who is purely a materialist will say, yeah, that's old-fashioned religion, or good, you can believe that, but I can't prove it, I can't measure it, I can't see it with my eyes, I can't put it in a test tube, so this can't be a reality for me. And our theme in anthroposophy is to say, this is the time of our human consciousness development where we have to learn again to see the livingness, the beingness of our entire existence. And so when this was my experience, when I first came into anthroposophy and started to study these thoughts, I thought, I'm not at all prepared to think of these archangels. I would like to see my angel, but I don't really see my angel. What can it mean? What can it mean that there are archangels in the season? I don't know. And this has been a constant quest for me to awaken myself into an experience of the beingness of everything that I live in, that everything that I behold. Well, perhaps you all remember that the author, the German writer Nietzsche, made his anti-hero say, God is dead. And many, many years ago, I saw a little cartoon take on that, which rather amused and intrigued me. It showed a man on the earth who was carrying a sign as if he were, picketing or something, a sandwich board, and saying, God is dead. And then the second, and only the second of only 2 frames next to that, showed a Father God in heaven with a long beard and whatever, and he was holding a sign that said, man is dead. I thought, how utterly appropriate, because to the extent that we say that God is dead, that's what we are. We are not really engaging in the livingness of the world. And I can only be so happy that we have access to the spiritual practice of eurythmy. That's how I have begun my awakening practice, because in eurythmy, everything that I do touches the livingness, the reality of my world. And so now another experience I would like to give you, and those of you who are joining my weekly Zoom eurythmy classes, you are living with this image. I bring this as often as I can. And if you're not doing my weekly classes, you can just live in this anyhow. But I love to begin my teaching by saying, before we were born, we were as great as the universe, as a sphere, together with the great beings of creation. And then when the time came for us to be born into this present lifetime or into other lifetimes, from the great distances, we took this light and we compressed and were compressed into a tiny ball of light. And this light that we have inside us is no less great than that huge light that we were born out of, but now it's all packed inside of us. And this light, this being light, is our essential spiritual core. And that came into the earth attracted by the mother and father and was laid into the mother's womb. And gradually it grew into the physical, etheric, and astral body that we wear today. And it was laid upon the earth. And then gradually we took up this body and learned to stand up. And we had to learn to use our senses and find our way in three-dimensional space. And as we became used to living in space, we forgot where we came from. And yet at any time, when we give ourselves a little inner pinch, we can remember that we're alive here in the hearts. The head has a hard time giving us that experience, even though the head talks all the time and keeps very busy. But it is, in our age, because of our journey towards freedom, the head doesn't really see reality. It figures things out, it analyzes, deals with our cars and increasingly with our computers and all. But inside of you, it's the heart that is receiving the world from all sides. And at the end of your lives, your heart will be weighed. What have you done with this spiritual being who lives inside of you? What have you done with your deeds? Yeah. So let's look for a moment at our question of what it is to be in the body, and death, and life, and freedom. Going back to the cycle of the year, we see that we have birth, growth, fulfillment, death, birth, life, fulfillment, and death. And these are things that we live in constantly, without cease, at every moment of our lives, including every day, waking, living, falling asleep, dreaming, there, including in our health, including in our digestion, including in our consciousness. And I think it's just fabulous that in the course of the year, this whole cycle of processes, being born, growing, fading, and dying, is all woven, it's all in the course of the year, it's all spread out so that we get to experience these archetypes one after another. We can live into them quite consciously, but in fact, they're going on all the time. And in that sense, we bear birth and death in us. Where do we experience the death processes in us? And many people, including Rudolf Steiner, but Naval, many people, East and West, Thich Nhat Hanh, You have to imagine that you're dying every day. Be aware of that. Be aware that what you have won't last forever. It doesn't mean being maudlin or grieving in that sense. Be realistic. For one thing, it gives us gratitude. But where else? Well, let me talk about in our metabolism and in our digestion, we constantly have the interplay between the anabolic, the building up processes, and the catabolic processes, the tearing down processes. We simply could not exist if we didn't, first of all, tear down the food inside of us and then build it back up to be a human being. And when you eat a cow, you have to take away cow, or if you broccoli or whatever, you have to tear it down and then turn it into humanness, right? To take that the next step, all of our nerve processes are considered cold processes, catabolic processes. Everything that we take in through the senses is a sclerotizing process. Where that takes us is to say every process of consciousness is gained by suppressing life. Every process of consciousness is created by tapping down this life process. Another way of saying that is our etheric body is all this anabolic work, but the astral body is all the catabolic. And wherever we're conscious, we have to tap down the life forces to make space for consciousness. Where that takes us then is the foundation for the way that the material natural sciences rule our consciousness nowadays. Because we are so intensely in our minds these days. We'll talk more about that in the next 2 weeks. But let's take that now on a historical, mythological level for a moment. And the point that we're going to try to follow, those of you who are students of anthroposophy are already going with me on this, where we say that we humans are living in this reality now because we are developing freedom. We could not have freedom if we had not been put into this world where we cannot see the gods anymore. But that's got to change next week. So let's begin by talking about the deep history of the earth. Use your imaginative thinking for this because it's prehistory. But at an early point in our humanness, we were as, to quote Rudolf Steiner here, it's very beautiful. Our bodies were so transparent. We were like we had bodies as light as flowers. Some of you studied the Human and Cosmic Evolution course with me last year, and you were on that track with me, right? Some of you remember that. We weren't really physical many thousands and tens of thousands, 100,000 years ago. But we also weren't free, because wherever the wind blew or wherever the gods had an intention, there we went. But then came the time when the human being was directed to the environment of the earth, and together with the substances of the earth, the physical world was formed, and into that the human being was given a body. A lot more to say about that. Again, have to go back to the Human and Cosmic Evolution class that we did before. But we were given a body, and in the early times, our consciousness was almost not exactly, but almost animal-like, that we knew what nature needed, not analytically, but even as an animal, just flowing into the events around us. And then comes a time, and the best story to tell here for me, or a very clear one we're all familiar with, is the story of Adam and Eve, if I may. We had this picture that an Adam and an Eve, two primordial human beings, lived in a state of pure innocence, unknowing. That's important. They weren't cognitive yet. They were pure. And then the so-called snake, we'll talk about this later, but the snake can be identified as the being we call Lucifer, the bearer of light. And this being said, look, why don't you try really getting a little deeper into matter? It will help perhaps if I tell you that we have this picture that at that early time, Adam and Eve dancing around in the garden, they weren't really tasting the apples. They weren't really in their bodies. They kind of like almost as if their bodies were marionettes. Can you imagine that? They said, let's take this body to the tree and give it an apple, not yet the naughty apple. And let's take this body over here and let's procreate or whatever. I make this up a little bit. But then this spirit of temptation said, why don't you actually taste that apple? You're a little too removed from it, a little too objective. Here, taste it. And if you do, you will have the knowledge of the gods. Why? Do you think that God told you not to eat of the tree of wisdom? No, no, no. Try this. You will be delighted by what it is like to actually taste the deliciousness of nature. It happened. They both ate the apple. Gabriel said, you're welcome to taste. You're welcome to that. But if you're going to do that, you no longer will have your innocence. Go. And now you're going to have to walk on a long journey of building knowledge, building wisdom, and eventually you'll come back to a paradisical state, but it will take a long time. And in the work of anthroposophy, which I invite you to deepen with me, that picture says that this was the way that the human being could develop freedom. By stepping out of innocence, by stepping away from unknowing and becoming conscious beings. Only by doing that were we able to rebel against our Creator, to deny, to ignore our Creator, build our own world with all of its machines and computers and be on the verge of destroying it, and then see if we'll be able to rediscover in a new consciousness how to find spirit in everything, and an out of freedom to choose connection and choose love. Yes. So that's the story of Adam and Eve. And we don't see Michael in that story, but he must have been the one who said, you're going to need courage for this one. I'll be around you, and where you need me, I'll help you. We'll come back to Michael in a bit. 2 weeks ago, I wrote for you an essay about Demeter and Persephone. Do you remember? Another story from the Greek times. Demeter, Mother Earth, the great being of nature. When Demeter was still, so to speak, metaphorically a virgin, there was constant spring and summer, perhaps no death. And Demeter had a beloved daughter, Persephone. the offspring of eternal springtime, was kidnapped by the god of the underworld, the god of Hades, and he took her. He stole the daughter of life from nature. And it is said that when that happened, Demeter refused to let anything blossom again. And creation fell into a great unbalance. Finally, with the help of others, there was negotiation. And because the earth couldn't blossom anymore, and Demeter was returned to the earth, Persephone was returned to the upper worlds, but in the kingdom of the underworld, she had eaten pomegranates. And the law of the underworld is if you taste of anything that belongs to that world, you belong to that. And so Demeter and the god of the underworld had to negotiate an arrangement so that half of the time Persephone would have to return to the underworld. And that was the mythological explanation for winter. And half of the time she would live with Demeter, and in that time there would be joy and happiness all around. Obviously, to the modern human being, we understand Demeter as the paradisical innocence of nature. And Persephone is a picture of the human soul who has to descend into darkness. And for those of us who study mythology and symbols, the feminine nature is generally considered the soul in men and in women, and the masculine is considered more like the individuated force. That we can deal more with that later. So with this, we draw out the picture that we have to look in stories to trace the evolution of consciousness. There are people who assert that humanity has had the same kind of consciousness since the beginning of time. They were rational, they were builders, I don't think that's true. I think we grew out of a mythological consciousness and only gradually became rational, and now only gradually become technological and informational and more dead. And it's urgent that we find our freedom now. So through all of this, we have the myths, and now we'll come to the myth that shows us powerfully the knight and the lady, because that's where we see Michael showing up in more contemporary history. We have many stories, I'm sure you're familiar with them, of the knights of the Middle Ages as dragon fighters. A word of acknowledgement to any Chinese people who might be here, because the Chinese cultures have a different relationship to the dragon as a very beneficent being. But in the West, the dragon is considered to be the dragon that hoards gold. What does that mean symbolically? He takes it, he's a greedy being, breathes fire, eats the women, meaning consumes the soul, and might destroy, burn up a whole town. Sounds serious. And the knights, which is the courageous one, have to prove their mettle by going out and slaying the dragon. And of course, in mythology, there's wonderful stories about the dragon slayer who rescues the lady, the human soul, and brings her back. This is pointing already to the Michaelmas, the picture of Michael that we have in our present age, Michael, who prepares us in autumn to go into the depths of winter, to go to the places where the maiden is hiding. What we need to go into the kingdoms of death and rescue our soul. Now, I really acknowledge that our questions haven't been answered yet, but I want, in this moment, we can look at the fact that, once again, man is dead, as God would say. What do we need to do to discover the livingness of our world? And in speaking at length about Michael, Rudolf Steiner points us in one way to say it's critical that we change our thinking and learn to think not analytically anymore. Rudolf Steiner tells us, and this is what we'll go into next week, that Michael now in our age is the regent of this 350-year cycle that we're living in. And that cycle began in 1879. So not only is he the archangel of the autumn, but he's also archangel of our age. And we've been living in his period now for 120, 130 years, 40 years. And if we draw these, a total picture, we could say we live in a general season of autumn. These 350 years are an autumnal experience for humanity. In this time with COVID, with climate destruction, with mechanization and all that, we're going to have a tough time going forward. This morning, I heard a conversation where it was said, humanity thinks that the urgent crisis of our time is COVID, the pandemic. But there are other crises too. One of them is starvation. It's just become massive. How many people are dying of starvation now, especially the sub-Saharan countries. But then they also talked about suicide. And there are over 800,000 suicide attempts every year. It's another pandemic. Why? Hopelessness. Hopelessness. And I hope that all of you are in touch with this gold in your heart, this light in your own heart. Because if you can touch that source of spirit inside of you, you can find a way for hope. Also, if you have an understanding that you have died before, you'll die again, our becoming is a long and ongoing process. But if you believe that everything about you is just material and nothing more, then life is much more difficult. And I can understand people who would choose to give up their lives if they have no way of perceiving the livingness. For myself, and I hope for many of you, my relationship to anthroposophy has given me what I deeply consider to be the forward-looking path of a really contemporary, utterly modern path of spiritual growth, spiritual investigation, spiritual hope. There's religion in it if you want it, but religion is like an adjunct to it. It's really a path of changing your thinking and finding freedom in it. And as I said a few minutes ago, for me, the possibility to do eurythmy is a real blessing And here I will also talk to other professions in anthroposophy, like my husband. Many of you know he's a biodynamic farmer. That's also a real path of living and enlivening life and death constantly. So perhaps, I don't know if all of you are expecting this class to go another 20 minutes until 1/4 past the hour. I know that Zoom has made it difficult for me to say that the class goes to the 1/4 hour because it's not an option on their automated system. But we have another 20 minutes here. So I'd like to do a little bit of eurythmy with you, show you another picture, and then take a few questions. And then, as I said, I promise that next week, we will look much more deeply at the spiritual past, spiritual awakening, the spiritual development, and the spiritual future of the Archangel Michael, whose name speaks to us as a great challenge. Michael means who is like God. And in the autumn, he's asking us, can you see God? Do you know that you are like God? Wow. I invite you to stand if you can. Those of you who can't, you can immerse yourself in this experience in your thinking. And if you want to sit, you can follow me with your arms, at least for most of this. So imagine and spread your arms wide, being as large as the universe. It was a time when you were turned inside out, looking directly at spirit. And then you were invited to leave that state. You became smaller. Try to continue to feel the whole world coming toward you, becoming a spark of life in your heart. And with a deep breath, drop your hands. Now notice these 3 capacities that we have as a human being. Feel this in your heart, living, warm love. And feel that you have a different task with your head, with your mind. The head is not naturally made for thinking, for loving, it's made for thinking. It's as if you have a whole universe of thoughts in your head. And the better we can think, the more light-filled it is. Imagine you have a crown of stars on your head. If you stand tall to feel this light above you. You have head, you have heart, and then you have will, your legs. And so now, plant your legs on the earth, ground yourself and feel, I am head, I am heart, I am will. As you stand there, get to meditate through this movement on what it means to be a human being. Breathe. And try to feel these 3 capacities in yourself always. And what are their different virtues? Light in the head, the virtue of the head is truth. Love in the heart, the virtue of the warmth of the heart is love. Power in the legs and also the arms when they're active. The power of your limbs is strength, courage. Again, this is not yet formally eurythmy, but it's an invitation to you that you can walk through the world like this. Remind yourself of this every day. And now I'd like to do an exercise that I've done with you who have done the eurythmy with me before. It's an exercise of weight, light, and middle. So this is an ancient Rosicrucian exercise. Step to the right, please. Step to the left. Feel your legs well connected to gravity. And I want you to feel from here with your thought, you don't need your hands to do this, but to feel that you're making a downward pointing triangle that goes deeply into the earth, another 2 meters if you can. You are so grounded. With this feel, weight bears downward. And inwardly, you can imagine this to be a deep, rich blue color. I choose here a dark color. And now, for the opposite experience, from here below your solar plexus, let your arms almost float upwards. Your arms and your legs have different gestures, but equal intention. Your legs and arms should be equally wide. Please don't have your arms like this, have them here. And another request, please don't look up. Instead, I want you to feel this crown of stars shining above you. Don't use your eyes to reinforce it, or you might lose your legs. So the upward triangle is yellow. The downward triangle is blue. Strength, light. And now think what's in the middle here. The triangle, a diamond shape of green, where the 2 triangles overlap. I hope you can imagine that. I hope you can see that. If you can't, keep working on it after this class. And rest, and rest. We'll do that again. Step to the right, step to the left, and feel weight bears downwards. Now, light streams upwards. In the middle, I hold the balance. Release and release. One last time, and feel the joy that they're really being in your body. And feel the presence, spiritually awaken to your presence. Weight bears downwards. It was you who created this movement. And from inside, know yourself creating light. Light streams upwards. And find that light in your heart and feel in the middle, I hold the balance. And release. And release. And breathe deeply. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have another 10 minutes, and I'd be happy to take a couple of questions from you in the chat if you have any. Otherwise, I'll give you another exercise, but if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat now. I love it. No, I don't see anyone typing. Karen says, will there be a PDF of this class? No, I'm not going to write a PDF. This was a long-ranging journey, but I will give you the link to the recording, and that will be available for a month, so you can watch it again. I will also write out the names of the books that I have, I showed to you, and I will give you a description of this exercise and another one that we'll do next week. You'll get that. So someone is asking about the Rosicrucian postures. This is the only posture that I am aware of. Surely there are others, but this was one that Rudolf Steiner taught, and that has been given on through the eurythmy stream. And actually, the eurythmy practice is not a practice of postures, but of streaming. So no, I can't help you with that, but it comes from this exercise comes from a lecture series by Rudolf Steiner, which is called The Theosophy of the Rosicrucians. There's another book for you. Let's see. So, was our eating of the apple of wisdom as a good move and or a necessary move for us to evolve, Joanna? That's the point of it. Yes, it was. It was. And it's, you know, Rudolf Steiner says to us, on the spiritual path, it's essential that we learn to live with paradoxes. That is to say, there aren't hard and fast rules. Life is growing and changing and metamorphosing, and paradoxes help us to bridge that gap. Yes, we had to eat the apple. One could even say, how could God allow that? But you could also say, out of infinite love, he allowed us to go so far astray in order that we would evolve into beings who could find freedom. And that a distant wish for us, which won't happen for a long time, is that we will become beings who can love so fully. We can love a new world into being out of our free will, to choose to love out of this place of distancing. Yeah, big, huh? What can we do for practicing with our children? That's an interesting question, because the way that we teach adults and the way that we teach children in eurythmy, and I assume you mean eurythmy, is very different. Because as an adult, I can give you a conceptual picture that you can fulfill. But when we teach children, we need an entirely different methodology. And that's why I don't do it online. I think it's much more difficult to do it on Zoom. With the children, we have to create fairy tales and images. We make the images and they swim into them. So for instance, at this season of the year, in a eurythmy class, and you can do this in a drama experience, that you tell them the story of the knights and the ladies, and look, they put on their big cloaks, and then they say, oh, I'm afraid of the dragon, and then they go out, go riding their horses, and prance around the garden, and then they develop courage, and they go in and slay the dragon, or things like that. Children are a bit older, they still need help to center themselves and so on. But I don't give them this feeling of weight and light and things like that, because it's not age appropriate for them. Now, okay, another couple of questions here. And we just have another, 3 minutes here. Joanna is back. I have heard it explained that the source is evolving. I like that. And wanted to see itself in many forms. So created creation to experience itself. I'm with you on that. So we would have to grow and become individualized to then know we are source as part of the one. Yes. We're in the process of returning or remembering, reclaiming ourselves as God, as part of the divine. Yes, and yes, yes. And what will come out of us as a seed, we could imagine to be something that hasn't ever happened before. Because we say all the other beings, and there are many, are obedient. And we're the ones who develop freedom. And so, if you will, we could say we are the first beings to create a new future out of our own separation, and our free will. We are the prodigal son, all of us. What was the intention of keeping, and no more questions for this week, please, because we have to end in a moment. What was the intention of keeping Adam and Eve from obtaining wisdom and knowledge? What was the consciousness of Adam and Eve like? I tried to explain that there was not crystallized matter in the beginning. It was all sensing and experience and not yet control. So Adam, a bit like the herd animals, not the individuated or the house animals that we have, but a bit like the herd, who just know things without thinking about them, have immediate knowledge. And that was Adam and Eve's, that was our consciousness in our innocence. And so it wasn't so much that they were kept away from it, they just hadn't developed a way of thinking. We had like a periphery awareness of things. Current thinking, we'll have to work with that a little bit more next week, is really mediated by the neurons. And we learned that that probably wasn't even the way that people thought before. Like the animals don't think like that. They're not analytical in that sense. In a way, we have to separate ourselves from oneness in order to figure things out. And I love your question, and I urge you to wrestle that question down to the ground. That one is key to pursuing the question of what is freedom? What does it mean to separate from God? And what could consciousness have been like before we did that? What could be the effects of the COVID vaccine to one's spirituality? We're working on that. I will give you this one, that also the question, what is the effect of COVID on one's spirituality? Is this a very unusual disease? It takes many people right to the threshold of death. It takes some people over the threshold of death. Is one willing to do that? I have known many health workers who have worked with people who've worked in the COVID wards, and they've seen how much death there is there. So I don't underestimate that. So what is the effect of COVID? The vaccine itself, even the ones that are genetically manipulated, they're not going to affect your true self. Your true self is much deeper than that. It might affect you in the times of the vaccine, but I know that if you use the Tuja and the other remedies, you're fine. And Rudolf Steiner did say about that first of all, he did not wholehearted or give a blanket advice against vaccinations. He said in certain circumstances, they are useful. And he said, and if you are going to vaccinate, the effects of it can be remediated if you also give the person who gets the vaccine spiritual nourishment, which could be spiritual medicines like the Tuja and other things that are healing on the medicinal level. It could be meditations if a person takes up a meditative path to balance out the vaccine, and also could be eurythmy. All of that brings the ego into the body, it's much stronger than DNA effects on it, because it's not really going into the core of the core of the core of you. That lives somewhere else. One more thing here. Can the vaccine have no negative effect on our bodies when our souls are in control of us ultimately? I think that's what I was just saying. With the effects of it, if they are negative or positive, be dependent on each soul's journey. Thank you, Joanna. Yes, yes, yes. Great conversation there. And of course, we fully acknowledge it's a trigger item for a lot of people, but I am really certain that the even worse than the question of masking or not masking, vaccines or no, even worse than that are what that is doing in the divisiveness of our society. So I refuse to get into arguments about it. Just say there are ways, whichever way you do it. But I think in my deepest values, what we do for the good of humanity is the most essential thing. And I always try to be sure that I'm not going to be a carrier or put any other person in danger. And I would even be willing to take on any effect it might have on me, to the effect if it helps me not to be of danger to anyone else, because the common good is more important than my own personal self-will in this life. And I didn't think we would go there tonight, but just a little glimpse into that. Dear people, thank you so much. And I hope this has given you some food, some nourishment. You can look for the link later on. I know that there are some, what, I don't know, maybe 100 people who weren't with us tonight who had registered. So I'll get the link out to everybody. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you next week.